Hey guys, it's time for my May wrap-up and, if you're lucky, a June TBR. This month I read The Dragon Business by Kevin J. Anderson, and I don't have the book to show you because I've already taken it back. That is one curse of renting books from the library. You don't always have them in time to do your videos, or you forget to do the videos while you have them. So The Dragon Business was originally published as a Kindle serial for Amazon, and it was kind of entertaining. It was a fantasy, but it was an irreverent fantasy. So think the Shrek movies, only with con men. I give the book 4 stars just because sometimes the more modern concepts and the modern talk that you see also a lot in Shrek, they make sort of references that are more modern. How Far, Far Away is basically Hollywood. Those kinds of references, there were a lot in this book. I made it feel less like a medieval fantasy, which is kind of what it was, but on the whole, that was really the setting that Anderson was going for. So I guess it was really more of a personal peeve that there was too much 21st century influence on the book, but no, on the whole, it was a really fun story. It didn't end exactly the way that I thought it would, and I'm wondering if there's going to be a sequel or if he's just going to leave it at that. So I'm a little curious to see where that's going to go, if it goes anywhere. I read, finally, The Book Thief by Markus Zusak. I had intentionally not read this book for a very long time because I didn't like to read anything that pertained to World War II because it was a tragic and horrible time, and it often depresses me to read or watch anything that deals with World War II. And lately I have been getting into a kick where I'm actually finding some really good stuff, some really good historical fiction and movies based around World War II, and I think I'm drawn to this topic recently because I always thought that it was just really depressing. It was a horrible time. There was a lot of evil stuff going around. I mean, Nazi Germany, concentration camps, just a lot of evil, tragic stuff. And what I'm finding is that the books and the movies that I'm finding recently are stories of hope and stories of courage and goodness in the face of all of this tragedy and evil. And I think that's why I'm really drawn to these stories recently, just because I never really put together the hope with the tragedy, and I'm really enjoying that right now. So, that is one big reason why I decided to read this book, because I knew the movie was finally coming out, and I'd read a couple of things recently dealing with World War II, and I thought, hey, I'm gonna give it a try. This is a really, really good book. I don't know if I'm gonna do a book review on it or not, or just this, but it surprised me with how good it was. I loved the narrator. I don't know, I loved that Death was the narrator. And that's not really a spoiler because he basically tells you up front that he is Death. The way Zusak describes things, he does not stick with cliché, he does not stick with the ordinary, he describes things in very interesting ways. And I really enjoyed that. It was a very interesting look. He masters some descriptions in here. And not only that, it's a really good story. I cried at the end because it's a sad ending, but it's a really good story still. And I gave this book 4 stars. I don't give it 5 stars because despite the fact that Zuzak's description was very original and most of the time very successful and entertaining, there were quite a few times where I read something and I couldn't quite figure out what Zuzak was trying to say. I couldn't figure out what he was describing, and sometimes it pertained to things that happened in the plot. Like, it took me a couple of minutes to figure out exactly what was going on. And it messed with the flow of the story for me, so that's the reason why it gets 4 stars. I should caution people, because I do always point this out, there is quite a bit of swearing in this book. It's usually just consistently 2 or 3 words, but most of it is in German, so I don't know how you feel about that. I also listened to The Fault in Our Stars by John Green. I had a friend who was trying to convince me to read this forever and ever and ever, and at the time I really didn't want a book about terminal cancer patients because I don't like sad stories. Or at the time I didn't like sad stories, so, yeah. I've kind of moved more in that direction. I like meaningful and heartwarming stories, so I finally decided to give this a try. And lucky for me, I happened to find the audiobook of it that didn't have a really, really long hold list on my library. So I listened to this on audio, and it was narrated by Kate Rudd, and yes, the narration was brilliant. I loved her performance. It was really, really good. As for the book itself, it was a good book. I can't argue that. It was a good book. It was well written, it was a good story, but I haven't yet decided whether or not I liked it. And a lot of this has to do with all of the talk of death and life. The main character is a terminal cancer patient, so this is going to be a big deal with her. It's contemplating life and death and what's going to happen when she dies, what's going to happen to her, what's going to happen to her family, and how the world is just going to move on like it always has. I found their talk of life and death to be kind of depressing. Well, a lot of it is probably because I didn't agree with their views. It was a rather atheistic view, a rather evolutionary view. And I found it very depressing, especially just with how the book turned out. I know that there are parts that are like supposed to be kind of depressing because the characters are kind of a little depressed, but the way that it ends, I get the feeling that it's supposed to end on a hopeful note, that they're supposed to be, it's supposed to be uplifting, but I found it depressing. And that's obviously not what the author was going for, and so for that reason, I'm not sure that I liked the book. There were a lot of typical teen stuff. There was quite a bit of swearing in this book. There was, sexual humor that I didn't appreciate, and there were just things like that, which is typically why I don't read young adult books, because it usually contains this kind of stuff, and I usually don't like it. For that reason, I don't know that I liked this book. It was a good book, and I'm glad that I read it, because it was an interesting experience. And like I said, it was a good book, but I just don't know that I liked it. I don't know that I'm ever going to read it again, and I haven't decided yet whether or not I'm going to watch the movie, so I'm still debating back and forth as to whether I give this book 3 stars or 4 stars, but right now I've got it at 4. I also read a non-fiction called Courage Has No Color. This is by Tanya Lee Stone, and this is the true story of the Triple Nickels, the first black paratrooper unit, and it was during World War II. It's a very interesting story because it talks about the Army and segregation and how they wouldn't let African Americans truly serve in the Army. They wouldn't truly let them defend their country. Even if they joined up with the Army, they were sent to do manual labor tasks. They weren't actually there to fight. And so this is about the first black paratroopers that there were. And it was a very interesting story. And I really did enjoy this. It fascinates me just how strong and courageous and determined so many people were during the civil rights movement. I mean, to obtain their basic human rights. And it fascinates me how much they put up with in their fight. I mean, they just had to put up with a lot of crap, and there wasn't anything that they could do about it, basically because they had to be on their best behavior to kind of trailblaze the way for equal rights for African Americans, and that fascinates me, and it kind of encourages me. So yeah, this was just a really good story. It is a beautiful book. I mean, it's full of pictures, and it's got all kinds of information in here. Great photographs from the time. You learn more about paratrooping than you ever knew, and you know what? What I really loved about this is that it didn't have a whole lot of excess information. Everything that you read in here definitely pertains to what's going on. One of my biggest peeves with nonfiction is that they give you too much information, just random stuff that was happening at the time that kind of correlated with what was going on. This did a very good job of sticking to the story, not only sticking to the story, but sticking to the interesting parts of the story. Now this could be because this is actually a children's nonfiction. At least I found it in the children's nonfiction section. And I think just Tanya Lee Stone, she did a really good job of keeping this interesting and entertaining. And I read through this very, very fast. I mean, it's only like 120 pages long, but I read through it really fast. And it was really interesting and it was really good. So this one gets 5 stars, and I would definitely recommend this to anybody. I also read The Crystal Bridge by Charlie Pulsifer. This is the first book in the Lost Shards trilogy. I keep saying trilogy, and I don't know if it's a trilogy or a series. So it's the first book in the Lost Shards series. And yes, I am anxiously awaiting the second book because there is a major cliffhanger, and I really want to know what happens. So I did do a review of this book, which basically turned into a talk on the entire science fiction genre in general, and why I don't read it, and why this book makes me want to read it more. So this is a sci-fi. It's a young adult, and it's the kind of sci-fi that sci-fi fans will love, but it's also the kind of sci-fi that people who don't usually read sci-fi will really, really enjoy. I don't usually read sci-fi because a lot of it goes over my head. This, I understood everything in it. And it wasn't because it was dumbed down, it's because it was explained in just the right way for me to actually understand what was going on, and I loved that. Not only that, it was a really great story. Really interesting, very original story. Oh, this one gets 5 stars. I also finished the audiobook of Cairnford by Elizabeth Gaskell, and this was it was a really fun story. It was definitely a different pace than I think any of the other books that I've read. It concentrates on the life in a small English town. It was just about normal life and death and the changing of the seasons. Not to mean that it was boring, because I know that kind of sounds boring, but it's not. It was very, very interesting. It was a great period piece. I give that audiobook 5 stars. Okay, so let's take a look at my reading board. So, as for my goals for 2014, my goal is to read 25 adult fiction books, and I read 2 more, so that puts me at 5. So, kind of behind on that one. With nonfiction, my goal is to read 10 books, and I read 1, so that puts me at a total of 3. I've still only read 1 biography out of 10. I finished 1 series out of 5. I still haven't reread any of the books that I want to. So, still quite a ways to go on my reading goals, but I'm working on it.